All right, so we are only 30 minutes behind schedule. I think we are good now to break into an individual work session, and we can keep this going, I guess, and maybe whoever, you can mute everything, and whoever wants to screen share, they can screen share, so others can kind of take a peek at what's happening. Maybe I might do that.
Should we also stop recording, or can we leave it on? I don't know in terms of both, like, do people feel comfortable with it, and even just not bandwidth, but recording, how demanding that is?
I think we should stop. I mean, because we're looking at maybe 1 or 2 hours of just like nothing.
Yeah.
In terms of like processing, in terms of processing things, maybe what I just described is computational complexity, just at the neural level. But I think there's something very interesting happening here, because I think the way we experience the brain needing more computational resources, it's very different than the way we do it with coding. For example, I'll give you an example. Like Barbara Tversky in her studies, she's always on the lookout, and I think half of her book, half of the studies she's done were about trying to understand the limits of computation in the mind, and when you know when you've hit the limit, you've hit the limit when you need to offload. So she was asking you about how I design buildings as an architect, and she said she has some architect friends, and they need to sketch all the time, so they need the paper and the pen to offload. I'm able to do like a medium-sized building in my head. I can go up to 5 levels. I know this is awfully precise. I can go up to 5 levels and see all the images in my head. If I have to go past the 5 levels, and of course every level is different, because if it's a hotel and it's the same, it doesn't matter how many levels. But I can be very precise at when my brain hits the limit in computing amount of spatial information and detailing, and when I need to pick up the pencil. So the second I pick up the pencil, I need to offload it because it becomes too much. But I think there's a more straightforward logic in when computational increases and you need more and more than for the brain, because sometimes things can be counterintuitive. Like sometimes you think, for example, let's say sound, right? If you were to add sound to the process of making architecture, the design process, you might think that's extra load for the mind. But if you do it in the right way, it ends up being less experienced in the first person as less difficult. So if you add extra computational centers, the whole subjective experience of the thinking process actually becomes lighter. I guess it gets distributed. So anyhow, yes, sorry, I kind of went off on a tangent trying to understand complexity from a subjective perspective, from a neural cognitive perspective, and complexity from a computational perspective.
So a couple of remarks briefly, but then we'll have to go back to the actual demo, especially now that it's recording. So computational complexity, I think, is pretty well defined. So you take your algorithms, and then it's going to have a certain amount of resources, being memory, being a number of instructions and all this. And I think it's risky to do the parallel with the mind. I think it applies. I think for sure we don't have an unlimited amount of resources with the mind. It's just that I'm wary of analogies of, let's say, the brain as a computer.
Oh, I'm not doing that at all. I'm not doing that at all. I'm trying to tease them apart as much as possible to try to clarify what it is that we're talking about. I'm not comparing them at all, just the language of it.
Yes, yes. I think, and there are some, how do you say, the principles, again, of just having resources and not having an unlimited amount of them does apply regardless of the, let's say, implementation. So I think, and what you mentioned about the different limits, and when you encounter such limits, let's say 5 levels for you for a building, and then how you have to offload, that's really interesting, because it is something like a marker or some way to see that the process of offloading itself is very meaningful. And if whenever we understand better, it means we can make better tools, because it's like, oh, I've hit a limit. I'm at the boundary of my resources. I'm going to either do it poorly or just not being able to go further. So if we can, let's say, monitor this kind of limits reached, and eventually either use tooling or reconsider different processes. I think usually when we design software, for example, it's going to be a higher level of abstraction. It's like, oh, it's just too complex, just too long. I need to refactor my code as a library. I need to use, instead of using 50 lines, I wrap everything in one line, and that's about it. I mean, it's very approximate, but managing then how much you have to recall, basically, so that, for example, your 5 levels become 1, and it's 1 building instead of 5 levels. So yeah. But anyway, I'm going to be a bit annoying. I'm going to say, let's go back to the demo. And I mentioned a bit before we started recording that I was going to show first, very unpolitely, just because it's going to be quick, and because I'm going to show something that was not initially what I thought I would show, because I've done what a lot of people are familiar with, yak shaving, which is like, oh, my goal is here, but I need this step to get there. And then I need to do something that is seemingly completely unrelated, but hopefully if you do it right, it's going to open a lot of possibilities. So to go back with the context, my little Raspberry Pi, the SD card, all this, it does its own little hotspot. So you have your own network, and it has a specific, let's say, IP address. And the problem is it's completely different from the Wi-Fi I have at home. And as you can see, it's unplugged. So I'm not using this, I'm using my home Wi-Fi. And of course, that broke everything. So I spent the last couple of minutes or dozens of minutes trying to understand. I mean, I knew why, but to make it basically more flexible. And in order to do this, I thought, okay, I don't want to go back, write the code, and then run it, and write the code and run it and inspect, because most of it, my trick, as some of you would have imagined, is because a lot of this is done via the web. But if I go from the code to the web, sometimes just slower. Anyway, I'm going to show the actual change I've done by sharing my screen. So let me know when you see it. I'm going to stop notification to avoid some silly messages while it's being recorded. So yes, let me know if you see it, please. And I can't see you, so you'll have to use your voice.
Yeah, I can see it. I'm seeing demo prototype day 1.
Super. Thanks, Mark. So first, I can show you what this looks like. That's just an example page. But that's the little server that runs on all the different devices. And what I added when I saw things were breaking was this REPL. So instead of having my server that say, oh, I'm listening to this address with this port, now it does that still, but it adds here some of the functions that I'm using or that I defined, and some of the variables to use. So for example, if I do found peers, it says nothing. If I scan my peers, it's going to say those 3 IP addresses on my network have been found. So what's new since this morning is this ability to interact with the code from the command line. Before I had to modify the code, let's say here, stop the server, restart it, eventually go back to the browser, refresh, for example, do the same command here. What happened there? Voilà, the same result, but I had to go lots of different clicks, let's say. And when there is an unexpected behavior, for example, not on the same network, so I had to change here make the subclass a parameter. That would have been too long, basically, to inspect what I did. So yeah, that's the little novelty added to the process. There is nothing VR related or text related yet, because in order to mount all the different pieces of text, all the different files, I need to fix some problems first. Hence all this black shading. Voilà.
I think that's
Yeah.
awesome. I think, yeah, like sometimes without these little kind of steps, you just can't get anywhere.
Are we
So
doing comments, or do we do every demo and then discussion?
I would say
How do you
comments
want
now, but we're going to keep it a bit short so that we do have the time to go through everyone.
So what I'm envisioning, if you have many devices, so that's kind of a real life or physical space spatialization of text. We put it on different devices in the physical space. Often you have the metaphor of casting things to different devices, but it would be very interesting to have to make any device being able to grab things from other places and also to throw from any device. So you could take a text and see the other devices visually and throw it to them, maybe even other people in the room, but have icons or symbols for the other devices. So you could both throw and grab things. So you could see documents on other screens and devices and grab them into the space. And also that goes for tools and palettes. So you can have any palette on any device. You could grab a palette and have it on your cell phone and walk around, and then you throw it up on the maybe not the TV but another interactive device, and so you could both for tools and content grab them and throw them. I think that would be a very interesting way to explore it further, because people stop along the way there, I think, and just see them as projection devices.
Another thing that is interesting to think about as you sort of have multiple devices being registered on the network, and right now they are literal physical devices, and by extension they are fairly substantial in terms of the scope and function of them, but when you have a mechanistic ability to construct something, then you can create a really wide variety of ways of delineating and segmenting devices and functionality and things like that. It reminds me of, in the United States, California has fully 10-11% of the national population, and so by rights, if it was made of states of the average size of states, then it would be 3 or 4 states, because the average state is only 6 million people. But the smallest state is only 700,000 people, and so California could actually split into another 40 states, and thereby completely unbalance the representation of the entire country. And there are like earnest and very well-meaning sort of intentions to be like, maybe California should be 2 or 3 states. What if it was 50 or like 100 or 500? What would that do to electoral politics? And so in that same way, thinking about, as you have the ability to create this ad hoc sort of constellation of devices that currently correspond to literal physical devices. What are the other things that you could create if you have virtualized operating systems for individual books or individual paragraphs, individual characters? What does it do? I think again, in the thing that I sort of talk up a lot about being in California is the waste, and what can you waste, and what are the consequences of it? It's fun to play with.
Very briefly on the segmentation or sorting or mereology, it's one of the things I did in the past, but I did not implement it back on this one, was basically the ability to store containers. So if you use Docker or Podman, then you have a kind of virtual machine on your device. And that's pretty convenient because you're basically not going to break things. You can really explore quite a bit with weird stuff without messing up basically the rest of your computer. And then yes, it's like how many, if you already have the physical device and then the virtual device and the virtual computers. And I think that one of the biggest thing is, and I try not to get too theoretical about this because it's exciting, it's interesting, let's say, but you might go too far without actually it being useful. Is to let's say set it up and then find one practical example. It's like, oh, what container, let's say, should I run, and then piping the result in and out. But yeah, it's I had some example with containers basically passing some information, including from the headset and then back, and it's actually pretty convenient to set up, and you can delegate also to the cloud if you want. Like you spawn a new machine. Set it up automatically, have the container run, process some information, send it back, kill the machine, and move on. So that works pretty well.
So, sorry. I've got a sort of linking thought that draws together a number of things I think they're being pulled upon. It started, the approximate parts are, Fabien mentioned sort of degree of computing. We also mentioned this sort of trying to do a degree of abstraction. You showed us that quick demo of sort of, how one small thing can make another thing easier. And it ties into something I'm beginning to observe. I just got sucked into a project at my old university, which in short is depressingly sounding like building yet another information portal doing exactly what the rest are doing. Basically because people are so tied to the magic thinking that in Google I can type something in a box and I get the answer. Well, we could debate that as well. But as part of the build up for this, I've been looking at control vocabularies on one side and ontologies on the other in the area that this thing will cover. And it's funny how different they are, but it did occur to me that some of the stuff I see us having to do for, say, for virtual reality building things, there's an awful lot of background data because you've actually got to confabulate the whole thing. But if you just want to count the number of chairs in the room, you don't need all the detail about the chairs. So there's an interesting flop over in terms of this thing of extra load. To count the number of chairs, I do not need all the information about the size, the shape, the color, the weight of the chair. That is still part of our knowledge of that object in the sort of problem space. I just need to know the number of entities that identify themselves as chairs. And there's an interesting crossover there. I say this because I find it really frustrating the way that sort of the world of linked data is almost a completely different world to the world of sort of metadata. And they ought to connect. And the lesson I think I'm drawing from this for myself is that it doesn't need a particularly strong bridging. The main thing is probably on the data heavy side, on the metadata. You need to make sure that you have as many, one or more if you need them, labels that you can use for this handoff. Because going back to Andrea's point, I absolutely recognize, you get to the point where your hand naturally feels for something because you need to start bleeding that data out somewhere. And the most convenient thing normally is a bit of paper. Or you might be sketching, you might be writing, it doesn't really matter. So anyway, I leave that thought for what it's worth because it seems to be overlooked, and we have these sort of two sort of informational processes that have sort of developed, and both seem to want to just sort of consume the whole of the problem. I don't think they need to. Whereas handoff between them seems really interesting in the context of what you've said about not doing excessive computing when you don't need to. I'll let someone brighter make something of that.
So who's next?
I am fading pretty fast, so in the interest of getting to it and then maybe having a bit of a kip, I might try to jump the queue, such as it is. I will share my screen or share just a quick time. Hopefully that won't do anything terrifying. Yeah, awesome. So, you know, what we were going to do is
Randall,
do something.
your settings screen is quite large in the video. Can you move it, or is it part of it?
This thing?
No, the settings where there's still a view. Is that part of the? Oh, it's part of the video. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll shush. Okay.
Yeah, no, it was intentionally there. Yeah. It was to get the camera up. So it's me talking and reading this passage. And as I sort of said, the thing that I was interested in is context restoration and the ability to kind of encode the reading as well as the text. And so I didn't write any programs. I just recorded my reading stuff out. So
could we play that? Because I was gonna read a paragraph before my demo anyway, but if you already read it and we have a recording of that.
it's garbage. I'm pretty tired, and so it's pretty faltering, and I was sort of reordering and well, not reordering, but adding line breaks at the same time as I was doing it. But it was interesting to think about having the actual process of reading, but also because I just copy pasted it into a notes document on my computer, that also resulted in it being editable in a way that a lot of the time when we are reading something, even on a computer, it isn't immediately editable. And so the various tidyings or changes that we might make in order to maximize our own sort of subjective sense. Like we do have highlighting, as Mark sort of said, but it's not nearly as structural or as substantial an alteration, and one has to be fairly committed to the sort of act ahead of time of doing the highlighting in order to commit to it in the first place. But you know, going any further, like actually cutting up a document as you read it for the purpose of reprocessing for your own particular kind of legibility or recall of it is probably a stitch too far for just about everybody. And to your point, Andrea, about the memorability of decisions, I think it was really interesting for me to like they're pretty basic decisions in terms of where I've added new lines to the passage in order to be able to kind of make sense of it. But just thinking about like if one was to construct reading as an action, as a sort of collection of activities, and to create sort of a workspace around that with these budgets in mind and with that goal of recall of intent and meaning in mind, then that would be really, really neat. And the way that there's this little me in this video was really interesting. It itself, because it's small and it's I'm not used to performing anything while I'm doing this. Any given freeze frame of it isn't particularly meaningful, but I read for about 6 minutes and then I sort of go off about what sort of other options or opportunities there might be to render these things more memorable by changing having the light in the room be programmable. That bulb behind me doesn't happen to be programmable, but I've got plenty in my house that allow me to sort of change the color or have the colors changed programmatically. And, having all of those things in concert might be able to kind of render a total context in which I have a few more things that render this concrete and memorable. And then after I watched that, I then recorded another video of myself. Where do I stop sharing? Where I didn't record on top of the recording, but I did at least just record. You can hold up. You can do multiple ones. So I just recorded myself after looking at it and talking about it. Again, because I'm tired and not a particularly good performer. I didn't do much moving of myself other than my little face. But yeah, it was really interesting to think about the sort of the meta layers that were built on top of each other as a consequence of that initial sort of prompt of the text, and the way that people are doing that with TikTok and Instagram and other places without it being particularly sort of popularly understood as metatextual. But that, yeah, we can build that for other reasons in other places as well. Was fun.
Could you quantify in some way, however imprecise, to what extent this exercise has improved your familiarity or knowledge of this particular paragraph as opposed to any other paragraph in the book?
I definitely have a sense of it. Reading it out was really valuable for me because it made me choose emphasis and skip ahead and sort of restructure my expectation for performance, because I like to try to make whatever I read be meaningful. I read to my daughter and I used like theater and things, and so the act of composing an oration of something is distinct from merely reading it. Sometimes people do that in their heads when they're reading, but I don't mostly. So that aspect was really useful for me. And then afterward, I spent time just reflecting on what I thought of the passage. The fact that Melville was writing at a time when we didn't really think that we could have such a sort of totalizing impact, comprehensive sort of influence over the world in as meaningful and disastrous a way as we understand our actions now. And so it's interesting to think about what he means versus what it means for us to be, chasing this massive whales that can at any moment just completely crush us, but we, have fished to the brink of extinction at this point. So yeah, like just being forced to sit with it and to regard it as significant in and of itself was really interesting for that. And that it was only a paragraph rather than an entire chapter has a different significance as well.
So we discussed this before, and I think there are so many interesting things to record here. To timestamp everything and record the gestures you have now with video, but also record the gestures, what you do with your hands when you work with the material. A while ago, I did a prototype where you could throw text out in the margin or a thinking space from the document, and I really think the thing you touch upon here is the notion of readings, that your comments on a book should not be should not be a whole. every reading is a bit unique, and it's good to record them. For many of my notes, and they really aged poorly. Some things are good, but when I read things another time or a third time for my favorite works at the 10th time, some of my early thinking, I feel that it's flawed. I want to keep it, but I also want to have it backgrounded a bit because you mature and learn more. So the notion of a reading and not the totality is really important here, I think. So, and you address that with the kind of temporal aspect to it.
I have a lot of things to say, but I'll wait for Frode to go, and maybe because he said he has similar things to say as Brandel, maybe we combine the discussion after Frode's.
I have something related. Mine is really brief, but on what Brandel is talking about now, specifically, I think we need to decide on what we mean by record, because over the last year and a half, the amount of time, money, and effort and frustration I have wasted, and Mark Anderson has wasted on doing our transcripts, has been very educational. Yuval Noah Harari said, writing was invented to solve different problems than speech, and it's so true. And we've also been looking at the technology of transcription a lot. So what Brandel is doing here is the opposite. So I think that what Brandel is doing, what speech can do, obviously it's not non-linear. You have to follow it, you have to listen, you have to do that. It's a completely different modality, and that is obviously completely worthwhile. But I think that's why we need to look at what we mean by record. We've talked about having text in a VR environment, and you can snap your fingers and the author will be there to guide you through it. Also, Stephen Fry did an early digital book, and all he did at the beginning, he put in a video about the fact that he's going to narrate this book. And it actually did add something to it. Similarly, one of my friends, she hates video calls. So we rarely do it. And when we do, because we're very close friends, it'll be, hi, we see what we're wearing, just get some context. And then we just ignore the video, similar to our meetings here. So I really think we should have discussions on not beyond text, because that's horrific, just kidding. But we should definitely have beyond the record. What does it mean? On that note, also, yesterday I had my meeting with the ACM. I'm going to pause recording for a second.
The Source City model, and someone had placed wheelchairs there. The drivable wheelchairs, and I tried it immediately, but you couldn't get out of them because they had someone hadn't programmed an exit function. So I was stuck in a wheelchair and trying to drive the city, and it was an eye-opening experience to experience 3D. I got stuck in a curb immediately and into something that resembled sand in the virtual space. It was such a shock to miss your mobility. Okay, that was a side note. So I wanted to break apart the sentence for my prototype to break it up a bit. I immediately got, when I imported the Moby Dick sentence into, let's share it into my code. I wanted to, do you see? Mm-hmm. So I wanted to make it curvy from the start to represent that text shouldn't be, well, it's linear now, but it doesn't have to be. There is one non-linear thing, a small flag hanging out of text here. But I wanted to have a curvy text to show that, to indicate that it could be any graphical form, the text. But when I pasted the sentence or the paragraph, it immediately became a very, very long line here. And that ties back to the whole structure. I've been playing with the idea of representing a linear text as a long line, either readable on a watch word by word, but also in a 3D environment where you kind of do a long string of the whole. So you don't do line breaks or paragraphs breaks. You have other kind of breaks, but not in the illogical places that I represent. Line breaks are often in the middle of a sentence, and page breaks are often when the paper metaphor breaks So if we get rid of that and do everything as a big line, we could do shapes that indicates chapters. I imagine that passages could be loops in this long string. So a chapter could be a loop. It could be a spiral where you come back for each chapter. It could be different sizes for each chapter, but loops. And what and I imagine decorating this. This is such a rich text. Where the harpoon was flung and stricken, fish darted, blinding spray. There are so many rich words here that could be not just decorated, but the text itself could embody that kind of, so the harpoon, so make the sentence have harpoon-like when you come to the harpoon, or fish-like, and you could replace parts of it, and not just for fun. It is fun, and it could be a way to stimulate the images or the kinetic senses, but also for landmarking. And I think one of the biggest problem with text on a whole is that it's so uniform that we don't have a recognition or recollection of where we are, or very few books or texts are unique in the graphical or sensed way. So we could, and in digital, we have the opportunity to do so much more, and even automated things. So what if parts took shape in the shape of the thing they represent? So I deviated from the thing is that I deviated from breaking apart sentences to actually representing longer passages. But I can imagine that text, here is a small example. The text can be branching. You could add comment and comment on your comments, and so it forms like not just trees, but it can, a text can in itself be the line that points between passages. I'm not a big fan of lines for line's sake, but we could just use the text as line in many cases. Maybe not for long distances, but I see. So, and I imagine this in VR, where you can actually draw and sketch out in air the shapes and the curves. So first you define the container for your thought. Maybe you draw a heart or fish, and then you speak into it or write into it, and it fills that container or line. So that's but I didn't have time to fix anything of this. So this is a representation of that, but with the idea of landmarking text and making it into kind of a sculpture. And this is a very basic sculpture, just a line with a small hook down here. My first when I poured the text into it, it actually looked like a harpoon, the first thing, which was very fun. Yeah, over. And how do I exit?
Brief remark, it's indeed the visual landmark was something I had in mind when Brandel was presenting the video of his reading, because we can identify either topics or keywords or something like that, and then just do a visual lookup on the web of a database of images or even 3D models. So for the one we don't find, we can generate even the 3D models now. And yeah, I think that's useful and tricky, because maybe the visualization will be very different from what the person had in mind. But yeah, that's really plenty of interesting things to do.
One interesting thing.
Yep.
Sorry, that I thought looking at that was that occurred to me. Two things. Is one is sort of well, because I suppose it all boils down to having the necessary metadata, but things like expressing sort of tempo of things, or especially these days when the current style is to no longer have strictly linear narratives. People now like to have multiple choppings of the timelines, but basically they take the linear story, chop it up, and then basically do it as parallel. Actually being able to sort of tease that apart, or if you have different characters going through different things, that's an interesting thing that visualization could be quite interesting for. Just sometimes for some people, just to help them understand the story, and others just to sort of see how it all patches together. Anyway,
You could imagine the whale having one line here intersecting captains or harpoons or other characters, so we can see where they meet up and where the lines are close together, and yeah.
Because
That's really cool.
I do recall somebody actually asking Michael Bywater, author, actually was asking somebody who's writing some stuff in a tool called Tinderbox, which is by the by something I have to use. But I remember it's lodged in my brain is the fact that he was talking to the developer. Was there a way in which he could, when writing, actually effectively visualize the sort of the emotional arc of the piece, which I thought was quite interesting. It was for two reasons. One is in a sense of, well, where are we at the moment? But also he had a sense that he needed to have various sort of crescendo in the piece. And so by being able to sort of plot that aspect of the text, being able to sort of put those as it were future points. Okay, I've got to hit that high point. I've got to build up to that. Because in this case, I think if he's writing a musical, but I don't know how pertinent that is, but it happened to be what it was there. So anyway, yes, just another little squiggle there.
I thought that was really, really cool. I really loved your sentence, Adam. You said something like, reading the word harpoon changes how you read the sentence. I thought that was really kind of key to everything, because even in my call yesterday with Barbara Tversky, she made this really interesting comment as I was talking about the different senses, bringing the information in. And she said, all information or all percepts that are forming, no matter whether they're visual or auditory, when they're formed, they always encode multiple modalities, even if they come through one channel. For example, I might see a harpoon, but the image of the harpoon comes with everything that I know about harpoons, right? So it comes with the actual object that maybe is in front of me or the image that I'm looking at, but the mind cannot help but activate all the other stuff I might be associating with a harpoon. So the second your eyes hit the word harpoon, there's all this kind of like hectic, and you hear the of the sail line behind the harpoon and the sense of danger, and all of that completely impacts the way you continue reading the sentence. So nothing after that word will be left free of all the associations that the word harpoon comes with. And this is kind of, for me, the point where I do think it's worth discussing how academic text and this more kind of dry approach to categorizing text leaves all of this stuff out. I think for me personally, I struggle with the dryness of the academic paper and the dryness of like categories and stuff, because I feel like they're not what actually helps you connect to a piece of text, of whatever kind of text, is the activation of these, unconscious networking. And I feel like academic text and a lot of categorization is actually going in the other direction. Instead of making the text more vivid and closer to how we actually connect to something, it keeps going in the direction of abstractness. So my prototype is very similar to what Adam was doing. It's like trying to process the information by going away from abstractness.
Yeah, and nothing forces us to read academic texts in a too academic way or in a boring way. Quite the opposite. We could take a dry text and mold it into something that is evocative in many directions and actually get something out of it. and something memorable, not just a wall of text with a few tables in it. So even though this selected text of Moby Dick has so many very active verbs that are very visual in themselves, I think there is so much opportunity to take, at least for the average text we encounter, but even for the driest of the academic text, you can find a sentence or something that creates a structure, evocative structure that you can read everything else in. Quite similar to the not thermos, but
The
what
bottle,
would you call
yeah.
it? Yeah,
Um,
the metallic bottle you showed before. You could use a metaphor to read with, and
Right.
but yeah.
For me, this is like the central human-computer interaction. There's like the billion-dollar question. Like we are drowning in data because the data is like, if we cannot make the data meaningful, we will continue to drown in it. And I'm afraid there are no shortcuts to take when it comes to making the data meaningful. The only path that I see right now is to have used technology to unfold the richness that the body needs to interact with to make something meaningful. Otherwise, you will have, I mean, we do have increasing garbage piles of data and keywords and categories and crap, but it's like, sorry, we're out.
I wasn't as deep as this. I was just thinking of the two things briefly. There was super sexy couple of years ago, like rhythmic typography, like converting a song, let's say, to typography where the text would just like jump on you. So I'm wondering if we could also do this kind of curve on a 3D model where the text become the object. So for example, here a whale, and then the text wraps around it. And that led me to think of the hero journey. I'm giving a workshop in a couple of weeks, and I'm not really ready for it. And I want to make to use the hero journey for it, where people, for example, I mean, if you're not familiar with it, roughly is the hero struggles and then grow and then overcome the big difficulty, and at the end they win, roughly. But just before the end, they're like super struggling. And it sounds super naive, but like a lot of the exciting stories we read are just that, but wrapped in different contexts. And I'm wondering if that could be the case there also, like instead of having a roller coaster of emotion, you have a natural roller coaster you can embody, because some of the text you map basically the hero journey to Moby Dick or to another story like this. And then, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if visualizing the text through that patterns would be rather coherent.
And that must be made with great care for the reader. If the author or a producer makes a text that is really stimulating, it could be hard to read. I can't stand highlighters almost. I can only read the highlights, and blinking and moving animations really draw so much attention. So we should have it so we could enrich the text on our terms as a reader more than a consumer of any sort. So it could be everything from quite still and meditative, quiet text to a very expressive text, and that we could move from those view modes depending on what you actually need for the moment. Do I need stimulation, or do I need some sort of focus and relaxation or concentration, and how we can express that to the interface so we get what we need. Yeah, over.
It's interesting. I minded to respond to something Andrea said. So I get this point about the dryness of academic writing, and I don't think most people set out to do it. It's partly that it's not fun to write, and you tend to absorb, you know, the style of the field you're in, because there's a sense of a style to which you're conforming. And two thoughts flash to mind. One is my dear supervisor, Dave Millard, who I share with Fred. When drafting out documents, in writing in LaTeX, sort of puts lots of stub comments and says, what is the point that I'm making here? And I'm thinking, why on earth do we remove these comments? Because actually, that would be so much more helpful, you know, right? You can ignore the rest of this paragraph, which is basically the supporting argument for this, if you don't believe it. But if you understand the argument and you do believe it, you don't actually have to absorb the rest of this. And that's something we should maybe circle back to. And because I find in the sciences, it tends to be basically too much empirical support information hides the main narrative. In the humanities, or certainly in the social sciences, everything's buried under lots of made up adjectives that don't actually really add any meaning. If you just state, this is what I think, it would be clearer, but often you've got to find it in paragraphs of really long made up words that don't actually give you any clarity. So a thought, so in a sense, going forward, and this is something for writing tools, is actually maybe we need, especially when we're learning to write in some of these forms, we may need perhaps some more active props. You know, you can take them out once you can stand on your own 2 feet, but to get onto your feet to start with, you might actually need these things to lean on. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
I think that's an important point on the argument over academic writing, because one of the things that's become very clear over the last while working on this is different writing is very different. Moby Dick is not an academic paper. They have incredibly different values and styles. And also, having had a meeting with my esteemed advisors this week, one of the things they do not want me to do is to have too many headings. So I'm going through my thesis now, removing headings. It's just, sorry about all the messages beeping here. They are saying that to an academic reader, it looks confusing because they use the overview or table of contents in a very different way. So although I do agree with the shapes, and I do agree strongly that paragraphs look like just gray columns, you know, this is something that we're working on. I'll just show you briefly to remind you. Here in Reader, we have select text. I've now selected all of it in spacebar. It loads the text up in this format. Not only is it linear, but not paginated. It also does breaks on commas, double break on period, and stuff like that. This could also be used for filtering. It could also be used for the coloring. But the reason I'm showing it is the underlying document has to fit the field. Otherwise, it just won't be accepted. You know, and this is what Mark said earlier, trying to sell visual meta to ACM is a human problem. Technically, it would take an afternoon for them to write the scripts. So, you know, let's just keep that in mind.
I have a somewhat unrelated observation. Okay, this is like, I shouldn't say this is a bit dangerous because it kind of, okay, don't take this too literally. Like yeah, this can be kind of read in a totally different way, but I'll let me just go for it. There's something very interesting I read in a book written by a biologist, like a researcher who also is Native American, but she had this really beautiful story about how when she was a first-year student in her undergrad program or something like that, she went to the biology department and had to have like an introductory talk to the biology person. And they asked her why she wants to study biology. And she said it was because she finds it very interesting that purple flowers always go with yellow flowers. And she just wants to figure out why that is. And she finds this like particular, very special beauty in these fields that were around where she grew up, that purple flowers always come with yellow flowers. And the person basically completely trashed her and said, this is not what biology is about, young lady, you are completely misguided. You better go study aesthetics or art or something else. This is absolutely not what a scientist does. Ask why purple goes with yellow. And, but, you know, try to go to intro to biology and see, but this is really not what we're about. Science is not your thing. And fortunately, she did continue. She got over the ego hit that was that whole encounter. But of course, it ends up being the case that the purple flowers and the yellow flowers were producing chemicals below ground that were helping each other grow. And there was a perfect symbiosis connected to the pigment and connected to those two types of plants. So there was a completely valid, completely relevant scientific explanation and line of questioning that went way beyond that. And we can go into the scientific level of like, what's the value of human aesthetic sense and beauty? We don't have to actually, because the argument still holds even without going there. But I think for me, the conclusion is that there's always some kind of relevance to immediate human experience that's behind any initial pursuit of a scientific question that I feel like is not being, there's no effort going in scientific papers in communicating the more personal lived embodied experience around that question that the actual scientist does have, but they're just not communicating it to us because they believe that's not part of, that does not have any scientific relevance, so it needs to be left out. But I think most scientists would still, you know, die on that hill and say, you know, that particular research, the paper should not have made any mention to the actual embodied experience of why does purple look so good next to yellow, because that's human aesthetics and subjective experience, has nothing to do with the chemicals in the plants and everything. But yeah, I think there's something more there, and there's something there that goes in many directions and is so profound that it even impacts our ability to feel friendliness towards academic texts. What's missing there, what's left out, that I think is illustrated by the story, reaches all aspects of science, including publication, including why we're here today, which is like the struggle to improve how we digest text.
This is really important, and it brings up an anecdote I heard this week, which is really relevant, and it is the study of stags, of reindeer somewhere in the world. What the study showed over many decades was that at a certain point, the biggest, strongest looks up and goes in a certain direction, and everybody follows. And that was the way it was taken. But then many years later, a group of female scientists went and had a look, and they looked at the behavior of all the other stags on all the video and all the records. And it turns out that all the stags will look up. There's only a few directions they would go: watering hole, breeding hole, you know, whatever. These special places, not random everywhere. They would look up, and at a certain point, the majority would look in a certain direction. So that's how they voted. And then the leader would just follow that direction. So it was the opposite. And the reason I think it's relevant is, you know, what are you looking at? What is the context? What is the metadata? Exactly what you're talking about. So when it comes to academia, there's no way we can change academia. I'm being told again and again once by the examiners, it's not scientific enough. It's too personal. So I have to go through and remove anything that sounds like an embodied experience, anything that sounds like an opinion has to go. However, and this is me not pitching visual meta just happens to fit. In a document, you have references, endnotes, and you have certain paratexts. Visual meta is yet another paratext. There's no reason other stuff can't go in there. For instance, what we've already done, as you all know so well, select the citation, you get the reference information. In there now, if you had put it in, it'll also have the original text. That's something that's hidden in the visual meta, not in the other stuff. So if we wanted to, we could further subvert these texts by putting other things in similar things. so that you get this full frontal, boring columns. This is academic, they'll approve it. But as you interact with it, there is actually a bit of depth, so you can get more shapes out of it.
I mean, one challenge is these interesting notions, of course, also have implications for the way in which we educate ourselves. Without opening up a whole thing, but so the problem of the expectations created in the way we're educated to do the task, and indeed the tools. I mean, well, certainly, you're definitely making an assault on the tool front, and that's a really laudable thing, because our ability to do some of the things that we're discussing are definitely depend for most people on the ideas being encoded into some sort of a tool that allows them to do the ideas that they're explained.
I'm going to be a lot more boring. Do we, logistically speaking, end in 6 minutes or 5 minutes now? Grab a bite and reconvene in an hour and 5 minutes?
Well, I think we can do that, but before that, if you don't mind, I'd like to talk about Adam. Because Adam, you do these great prototypes and systems, but you refuse to kind of write them down. You think that's boring. You've showed something really worthwhile in this presentation here today. And, we're going to have a transcript of this conversation, but it is going to be shit, because they all are. As I said many times, the difference between speech and writing is so different. Can we ask people in the community, including you, Adam, take a few screenshots and just write what it is? It translates it by going through your brain as well. You get a chance to clear it up, because going through these pages of people, including what Fabian just said and what I'm saying now, which is about the day, should that be removed from the transcript? Should it be in a different color? Should it be normal in the transcript? The really good bits are so hidden. So address what Fabian said, but please consider, and please tell me later when you thought about it, even for meetings like this, is it appropriate to ask you guys to write a half page or a page and maybe do some screenshots?